Sorry. Everyone online, can you hear us?
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so welcome everyone. Today we have a guest speaker, Dr. Student at FIU, Mekdelawait Deribe. She is a PhD student at Florida International University, focusing on sustainable management of transboundary water resources, particularly focusing on the Nile Basin. He holds a BSc in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Addis Ababa Institute of Technology, and two master's degree in environmental science from Groningen University in the Netherlands, and another one in hydraulic engineering, Addis University. Mekdelawait, or Ms. Deribe, actively engages in discussions on Nile utilization, having written her master's thesis on its equitable use, contributed to various panels and opinion pieces dedicated to social advocacy in the Nile Basin, promoting dialogue and understanding among its communities. Today she is here from Miami. We're going to talk about rethinking equity in water use, how water should be used among the different Aryan countries or states. So, thank you for this time.
Dr. Kabrat, thank you everyone for coming. I was not expecting a big turnout, so I'm pretty pleased with this crowd. I like Dr. Kabrat. My name is Mekdelawait. I am a doctor, PhD candidate at Florida International University. This is probably my next year is going to be probably my last year. I have been studying water for my entire life, essentially my entire academic life. And I hope to tell you today about a case study, which maybe you've heard about, maybe you haven't heard about, but today, after my presentation, you would know a bit about my research area, the hype in the media is about, and hopefully try and understand my perspective of dealing with that whole issue. So my research, my PhD thesis is on equitable and sustainable utilization of the Nile. My talk is more focused on rethinking equity, so trying to show you what research I have done so far, other efforts across the world and other research areas on how to deal with the Nile issue and our way, in my view, in my PhD research, our way of going forward. So before I start, I want to have a little bit of a Nile trivia just to see where the audience is at with respect to knowledge on the Nile. So I have a couple trivia questions. So first up, true or false? Nile is the longest river in the world. Shout it out.
True.
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 Visible audience. It is true. The Nile is the longest river in the world at almost 6,700 kilometers. That's more than 4,000 miles. Second up, how many countries does the Nile cross? Wow. Okay. 11?
Yes.
Everybody knows?
Oh, 11.
Just go home now. Anyway. Not a lot of crowd knows that. So it does cross 11 countries, but not everybody knows that. People just attach the Nile with Egypt or the Nile with Sudan, which is a pretty big misconception. We'll get into it later on.
They have done their homework.
I know. Pretty excited. Okay. Where does most of the water of the Nile come from? Is it Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, or any other country in the Nile Basin that you might know? Because you know there are 11 of them.
Uganda, yeah.
Uganda.
Trick question, all of the above.
Smart. Anybody else?
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia, actually. There we go. So 86% of the Nile water comes from Ethiopia. The rest 14% is contributed by what we call equatorial countries, of which Uganda is a major one. Finally, okay. What's the first thing? I like this question. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear Nile?
Crocodile.
Snakes. Okay.
It runs north.
It runs north. Okay. Wow.
Ancient Egypt.
Egypt. Okay, that's a common answer.
Conflict.
Conflict, another common answer. Abyssinian, yay, okay, yeah.
A really bad dam.
Okay.
An Agatha Christie novel.
Oh, yeah. That's on the Nile. That's all. That's a new one. Okay. So at least you're aware of the Nile. Above average, you know about the conflict, you know about the dam, you know how many countries there are. So we have a good basis to start with. Okay, so historically, the Nile is a very complicated, an area with rich history, right? So it has been the seat of ancient civilizations, including the famous ones, the Egyptian civilization, but also the less known ones, the Aksumite civilization from Ethiopia, Merovingian Nubian civilizations from Sudan. And these civilizations have been responsible for many of the many innovations across the world. So mathematics. Have you ever heard of the Pythagorean theorem? Logic goes that the legend goes he developed that, seeing the shadows across the pyramid. Don't know if that's true or not, but we'll say mathematics. Calendar, the first calendar in Egypt was developed based on the ebb and flow of the Nile, right? So following the annual flooding and going away of the Nile. Agriculture, especially irrigated agriculture in Egypt and all across the Nile basin. It was one of the first areas next to Mesopotamia which developed irrigated agriculture. Anybody knows what a nilometer is? So the nilometer is essentially the ancient Egypt's way of measuring the height of the Nile, right? So this structure here, incredible actually. So they built the structure to measure the annual level of the Nile. So farmers could essentially know whether to expect a dry period or a wet period. So a little bit of a precursor to our current hydrology. So it's a very fascinating region steeped with history, civilizations, culture, but it's also a very geopolitically volatile area, not just now, but throughout its history, right? So the Nile has always been used as a bargaining chip, right? So ancient Ethiopian kings used to threaten downstream Egypt, saying, "We're going to dam the Nile if you don't stop persecuting Christians in Egypt," and vice versa. There used to be royalty payments for the Nile water. So yes, Turkish. They're not called Turkish. They're uh, the ancient Turkish Empire.
Ottoman.
Ottoman, my God, yeah. The Ottoman Empire used to pay royalty to upstream countries for the Nile water, right? So there used to be this kind of relationship. Saying the Nile of the water is actually holy water, and a person who drinks from the Nile doesn't die or like doesn't decay. That sort of stuff. That spirituality extends all through the Nile basin countries. So it's not just a river that just exists, but it's in the political, the social, the economic, and the political psyche of people across the basin, not just Egypt, not just Sudan, not just Ethiopia, but all entire countries. Now going into like the crux of the basics of the Nile, the area that you see in blue is the Nile River basin. And it is, as we said, the longest river in the world at almost 6,700 kilometers. It does cross 11 countries. The sources of the Nile are here, Lake Victoria. So this is the equatorial region. This would be countries like Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, Kenya. They drain into Lake Victoria, and then the source of the Nile originates from Lake Victoria. That source is called the White Nile. It is longer, but it does not carry a lot of water. The other source is the Blue Nile. There we go. So The heart-shaped lake, it's called Lake Tana. It's in the center of Ethiopia, and that is the other source of the Nile, which is called the Blue Nile. That contributes the majority of the Nile water. So the White Nile, all the way from equatorial countries, and the Blue Nile, they actually merge in the capital of Sudan, Khartoum. And then there's another river, Tekeze, a minor river that joins them, but it's after the confluence of the Blue and White Nile that the Nile actually forms. So this iconic picture, you see how one river is lighter, the other river is darker? That's actually the confluence of the Blue Nile and White Nile in Sudan. That's actually a real place. This island is called Tuti Island, and you can, on a boat, you can actually see the two waters merging. It's pretty spectacular. So all of these countries, close to 500 million people living in all these 11 countries depend on the Nile water. But more importantly, more than almost 300 million people live within this blue area, which we call the Nile Basin, right? So those people live in the basin, dependent for their food, water, energy, directly on the Nile. But more broadly, close to 500 million people, 500,000 people. Close to 500 million people depend on the Nile waters for their water energy demand. And as someone said earlier, it does flow from south to north. It's one of the few rivers in the world that flows north. So we said it's the longest river in the world, but it's not really a large river. And we said almost 500 million people depend on it. By comparison, the Nile annual historical flow of the Nile is around 84 billion cubic meters. More recent studies have raised that number to about 95, some studies 97. At best, let's say 100 billion cubic meters. That's nowhere close to other rivers of comparable length, right? So our like the local one, Mississippi, to 6,275 kilometers, but 580 billion cubic meters annually. Amazon at 6,400 kilometers, which is the second longest river, and it carries more than 7,000 billion cubic meters. So that comparison already shows you it's not a lot of water that the river carries, but a lot of people depend on it. 500 million people. This is the proportion of how much water each tributary carries. Like we said, the White Nile from the Lake Victoria region contributes about 14%. It's not a very seasonal water, so it's dependable. You can see the hydrograph, the amount of water doesn't really fluctuate much across the year. It's a more dependable source of water. But the majority of the water of the Nile comes from the Blue Nile. And as you can see, the Blue Nile is a very seasonal river. And most of the Blue Nile originates from Ethiopia. Question?
Are the Ethiopian highlands higher in elevation on average than the area around Uganda?
Absolutely.
I didn't know that.
It's called the roof of Ethiopia, the roof of Africa. So, yeah, and most of the water comes from those highlands. And the rainfall pattern in Ethiopia is that we get almost all of our rainfall within 3-4 months, from August to essentially October, August, September, October, though that's it. So you see that peak there, that's where we get most of the water, but it contributes much of the water. And then the Atbara River, the Tekeze Atbara, which also originates from Ethiopia, so very seasonal river. So the Nile, because of the Blue Nile and the Tekeze Atbara rivers, the Nile itself tends to be very seasonal. So you have a lot of water during those rainy seasons, nothing at other times. So like I mentioned earlier, 86% comes from a single country, Ethiopia. The Blue Nile and Tekeze rivers combined, 14% is contributed by the equatorial countries. So the portion of the White Nile that rises from the Lake Victoria region. When it comes to usage of water though, because of things that we'll get into later on, despite the fact that 86% comes from Ethiopia, 14% comes from the other countries. It's completely, almost completely utilized by just two countries, Egypt and Sudan. So according to the latest water allocation agreement, which is not inclusive, not sustainable, we'll get into that later on, but as of now, Egypt isn't allocated, and I say allocated in quotations here because that's a very contested treaty, but 86% of the water, more than 86% is used by Egypt, roughly 22% by Sudan, 10% left for evaporation. We add that up, that's 100. So these upstream riparian countries, which are the sources of the water, on paper don't have any share, right? So obviously that has roots on colonial treaties, but that has raised a very, very serious question of equity in water use. Forget sustainability, equity is a huge question. Now, you might ask why that agreement, that skewed arrangement, that comes from colonial era agreements. Like we mentioned earlier, controlling the source of the Nile and management of the waters of the Nile has always been a huge issue historically, all the way going back to the Romans. They wanted to control the source of the Nile, but they were held back by the Sud wetlands in South Sudan, so they couldn't get to all the way down to Lake Victoria region. So that's like first century. And then later on by the Ottomans from like 15th, 17th to late 17th, late 18th century, there were efforts to have the entirety of the Nile Basin from source to mouth under one banner, right? So these efforts have always been there, but they became intensified during the colonial era. So all the way from 1891 till 1959, there have been documented efforts of controlling the water. So for example, in 1891, the UK and Italy, and you'll notice most of these agreements are between colonial powers during the time. So UK, Italy, France, and Belgium. Yes?
Quick question. In 1999, when I was at UCLA as a grad student, like they are at the Institute of the Environment, our professor said that most of the aid package, Egypt being the second largest recipient of US aid after Israel, most of it was devoted to military material, weapons and missiles facing Sudan and the other countries to the south of Egypt. He said that that was the policy for US aid to fund Egypt so that it could maintain this hegemony over the Nile. Is that still true? Was it true then? Was he misspeaking?
I'm glad you said it and not me. Because that's a big part of the equation, but as an academic, I have to maintain my balance. But power dynamics, aid, geopolitical power plays, that's a big part of the equation, and we'll slightly get into it, but I cannot comment on that. Going back to the treaties. So, for example, in 1891, UK and Italy, UK was dominant over a large part of the Nile Basin, including all of the equatorial countries, Egypt, also Sudan. Ethiopia, FYI, was the only country that was not colonized. So when we're talking treaties, Ethiopia is the only country which could sign for itself. The other countries are colonial protectorates, right? So in 1891, Italy had a dominion over Lake Atbara, River Atbara, and UK had a large dominion. So there they agreed that Italy would not interfere with the tributaries of the Nile over which it had influence on, period. So not to significantly affect the flow of the Nile River within its sphere of influence. The point being, the United Kingdom had massive, massive cotton plantations down in Egypt first, which later on extended to Sudan. So if water is tampered with upstream, Egyptian cotton plantations, cotton plantations would suffer downstream, which would affect the textile industries in Europe. See the chain? So all of these agreements, and again, in 1906, UK, France, and Italy, they signed an agreement as to how to manage the water of the Nile within their own dominions. In 1929, this was actually the first agreement which tried to volumetrically divide the Nile waters. So in 1929, Egypt had already its independence in 1922, but Sudan, UK was still the colonial power over Sudan. So when UK wanted to expand its agricultural exploits just from Egypt into Sudan, they needed to use some of the waters in Sudan, which is why they signed an agreement with Egypt, by then a free country, saying will take 4 billion cubic meters of water for irrigation in Sudan. Egypt would be entitled to 48 billion cubic meters of water, right? And don't forget, Egypt is highly dependent on the Nile for its water use. Essentially, the entire country is built around it. So they signed that arrangement. So 48 plus 4, that was around 52 billion cubic meters of water, not even close to the full utilization. But that was the first efforts in terms of volumetrically dividing the Nile countries, the Nile water among countries. In 1949, Egypt and UK had an agreement about a dam that was being built in Uganda. So that already is a bit of a disconnect there. Egypt and UK on a dam in Uganda, but UK had dominion over Uganda, saying the dam would be built, but an Egyptian engineer would be on site monitoring the flow of water downstream so that it doesn't affect Egypt, right? There are in between, okay, this is not chronological, okay. In 1902, Ethiopia and England also signed an agreement saying Ethiopia would not do anything to fully block the flow of the Nile water. Obviously, nobody can do or nobody should do anything to fully block the Nile waters. In 1925, the UK and Egypt again agreed on another treaty. That was sort of a precursor to the 1929 agreement. In 1934, there was an agreement between UK and Belgium because, again, Belgium had a little bit of a dominion over Congo, so they wanted to protect the contribution of the Congo to the UK. You get the point. The intention of all of these agreements was that to ensure uninterrupted flow of water reaches downstream. And then finally, in 1959, this agreement is called for the full utilization of the Nile water. So the idea was in 1920, the agreement signed between UK and Egypt in 1929 did not utilize the full waters of the Nile. So for the full utilization of the Nile, updating that agreement instead of just dividing 52 billion cubic meters, in this 1959 agreement divides the entirety of the Nile water, 84 billion cubic meters between Egypt and Sudan. So that arrangement that you saw earlier, 66-22%, that's where it comes from. So the 1959 agreement allocates 55.5 billion cubic meters of water to Egypt, 18.5 billion cubic meters of water to Sudan, 10 billion cubic meters of water to evaporation because these are desert areas. Add that up, how much does it become? 84. So that leaves essentially nothing, zero, for all these upstream countries, which happen to be the source countries. In addition to that, the 1959 agreement also had stipulations which said, should the upstream countries raise a claim to the Nile water, Egypt and Sudan would agree among themselves. And if they deem it correct, then the shares that these other countries are asking divided from Egypt and Sudan's shares. It's a very big issue, especially if you're talking with sovereign countries. So this is just a snapshot of the history around water use, right? But they have some commonalities if you look into all of these things. They are inclusive. Let's start from the beginning. So these are signed between 2 or 3 countries, many of whom did not have their own independence, right? So they are definitely uninclusive. There was no basin-wide arrangement. There was no inclusive arrangement, which includes major countries. Definitely unequitable, right? Like we mentioned, many of these agreements did not consider the need or the rightful share of upstream countries, and they're definitely unsustainable. They did not have the future in mind, right? And some of them do actually infringe on national sovereignty. How are you going to sign an agreement about a dam in another country, right? How are you going to insist that other countries' shares depend on whether you think their claims are legit or not, right? So these agreements might have been okay, and I say that very mildly during the colonial times, but they definitely do not stand. They definitely cannot stand now, where many of these upstream countries now are free countries which can make decisions for their own, and many of them have rejected these colonial era treaties. And so they become unlawful because the Nile is a transboundary river, meaning it crosses political boundaries, right? And as such, it is managed by international law. And there are 3 tenets of international law when it comes to water law. 1, every country, each and every basin country, by virtue of it being part of the basin, has an equitable and reasonable share. 1. 2, no country can cause, when I use the water, I cannot cause significant harm to downstream countries, or vice versa. Used by downstream countries should not cause significant harm upstream countries. So the principle of equitable use, the principle of no significant harm, and then the third procedural principle, which is the duty to cooperate, right? So none of these agreements would fly in the face of international law. So talking about them now, they become unlawful. But there have been efforts in more recent years. For example, in 1993, Ethiopia and Egypt signed an agreement in 1993 saying, we'll cooperate. This is a huge shift from how things were back then, right? So it doesn't have like details on how they're going to cooperate, but at least they had an understanding. And that was fairly based on international principles. But for the first time in our history, like in the thousands year of history of the Nile Basin, all basin countries, except one, Eritrea, but they had an observer status. So all 10 countries came together, negotiated for 13 years on what we call the CFA, the framework, the cooperative framework agreement. One, on revamping what guides the Nile Basin, right? Not unequitable principles, not colonial-era treaties, but principles of international law, meaning equitable use and no significant harm. So, and it had 44 articles, so they negotiated on each and every one of them. They were stuck on one sub article, which is why it has been pending for the past 14 years, but it actually finally came into force last month for 2024. But in 2010, there was that effort. Well, where it was inclusive, it was lawful because it had the foundation of international law as its basis, and it was trying to be equitable. So there is that framework now. And then in 2015, 2015, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt signed what we call the Declaration of Principles on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That's not necessarily a basin-wide framework. It's a very dam-specific, infrastructure-specific framework, but I don't want to make it sound like it's all doom and gloom. There have been positive efforts in more recent years as well, but nothing comes close to dismantling the legacies of the colonial era treaties, because on practice, the 1959 agreement and that water allocation is what still guides water use discussions right now. If you hear water use discussions, even in the UN, what you keep hearing cited as Egypt's share, Sudan's share, are those numbers that go back to the 1959 agreement. Understandably, the 1959 agreement is absolutely rejected by these upstream riparian countries, most vocally by Ethiopia, because Ethiopia contributes 86%, uses none of it, and there is no room to negotiate, which is why in the basin right now, we have little water, lots of people to feed, unequitable water use arrangements. So a very, very, very big question of equity. I did not make this graphic. I just lifted it up from a newspaper. So you can see how the Nile is portrayed out there, right? On top of that, the population right now is 500 million, but it's expected to double by 2050. 1 billion people to feed, 1 billion people to provide water for, 1 billion people to provide electricity for. Not to mention, not just more people with a better quality of life, right? That's going to increase the water demand tremendously. So this is just a rough estimate. Irrigation demand right now across the basin is 82 billion cubic meters, which is almost close to the entirety of the Nile water, but that number is expected to be about 138 billion cubic meters by 2050. We don't have that much water, and that's just irrigation. There's domestic water use, there's industrial water use, there's environmental water use to consider, right? So we have a lot more people, a lot more demand, and then the elephant in the room, climate change. How is climate change going to affect the basin? Luckily, it's not all dreary for the Nile Basin. We do expect a slight increase in rainfall, which would mean a slight increase in runoff. But that's just partial good news because it's nowhere near to the rise in demand, right? So we really are in a sticky situation where on the one hand, you have equity, right? Like every country wanting its share. But on the other hand, there's the question, the bigger question, in my opinion, of sustainability. Looking to the future, what are we going to do? How are we going to feed this billion people? Make matters worse, most of these people currently living right now in the Nile Basin don't have access to food security, access to water security, access to energy security. With the exception of Egypt, many of these countries in the Nile Basin, Ethiopia, Sudan, all these equatorial countries have a very low GNP, what's it called? Gross, not GDP. It's a metric that shows like the quality of life.
HDI.
Yes, HDI, like something
Human development.
Human Development Index. They have a very, very low, nice. Yeah, they have a very, very low Human Development Index, showing you, even if we had like 100% food, water, energy security, we would be having a very hard time in the future. But we have an uphill battle because food, water, energy, these are human rights we're talking about, right? So managing this water equitably and also sustainably is an existential issue, as Egyptians usually put it, for the Nile Basin, because it's a matter of ensuring basic human rights, right? So that's my question. How do we ensure equity and also sustainability in the Nile Basin? Yes, sir.
You're talking water and sustainability, and you said that part of the conflict previously is that they made a law, water can't be used upstream in any way that diminishes its use downstream. But that sounds remarkably like what Václav Havel defined sustainability as, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the future. And if the Nile is looked at as a stream, not only going through space, but going through time, it should be that you can use water upstream without compromising its use downstream, because after all, it's water. What we're talking about is people abusing water, contaminating water, so that when it gets down, or if it evaporates, there's ways that you can diminish its volume. But it seems to me that with today's technology and awareness, we don't have to blunder back to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. We can simply make that same law that used to piss people off, excuse my French, and say, you can't upstream use it in any way that damages the downstream use. Downstream, you can't do anything that damages the upstream use. You've got to make sure that the cycle in the circular economy completes. Right?
My thesis is essentially trying to quantify and conceptualize and operationalize that. Because I do believe there's a way to manage the water equitably and sustainably, at least in the long term, at least in the short term. Forget long term, but I do believe there is a way. The problem is when you manage transboundary waters, you're making me skip ahead of my slides, but it's not just about the science, right? Like you already see there's a lot of politics in it. There's a bit of a law in it because it's not a river that's confined within one country, right? So when I want to study transboundary waters, I have to read the law. I have to be at least a little versed in diplomacy, to obviously have to know my science and engineering, right? So it's a very transdisciplinary way of thinking, which requires a lot more expertise, a lot more time, a lot more efforts than like, not that we have any simple problems these days, but a lot more complexity than other problems to deal with. So I completely understand and agree with you. It's just difficult to detach from those principles, especially when some countries insist on it, right? Where were we? So, okay. So that is my question. Make sense? Which is why I did a master's, multiple degrees, and also why I'm trying to do my PhD on it, right? It's not a simple thing we can just check off. So my approach was, okay, transboundary waters, the Nile is not the only transboundary water across the world. All the blue that you see, it's all transboundary river basins across the world. We actually have 313 transboundary river basins across the world. And not everybody's fighting. So there has to be lessons that we can learn from other regions, not to copy, but to contextualize for the context of the Nile Basin. So we actually just published a paper a couple of months ago, trying to see experiences from other river basins and trying to contextualize it from the Nile. And these are some of the experiences that I chose. Let's start from home. Anybody knows about the Rio Grande, Colorado River issue? You might know about the drought right now, but that's actually a good experience in the sense that in 1906, when, well, actually a bit for 1896, when Mexico first complained about Rio Grande rivers drying out, not going lower, drying up because farmers in the US were extracting more water. The US first just ignored it, but then they came to negotiations and they actually came to an agreement which addressed Mexico's historical injustices, felt injustices. They said, okay, we agree, we understand, we're going to build the Elephant Butte Dam, and then we're going to transfer X amount of water free of charge to Mexico, right? And Mexico, you're going to let go of all your historical grievances. That agreement still stands. It has been updated throughout the years. So in 1906 is when they signed this agreement. And then later on, the Colorado River Compact in 1944 was signed. And that one is another great example. That is an example of what not to do and what to do, actually. So in the Colorado River Basin, one, they overestimated the amount of water there was. And two, they divided the amount of water numerically. So let's say we have, I'm not sure about the numbers, so I'm just going to throw out random numbers. Let's say we have
Yeah, 15
acre feet.
Yeah, acre feet, million acre feet, 15, 7.5.
Exactly. So 7.5 up, 7.5 for the upper Colorado states,
Yeah.
7.5 for the lower Colorado. But Colorado is also a transboundary river. Some has to go to Mexico. So 1.5 million acre to Mexico. So now what happens 50 years later when climate change happens or droughts happen and you don't have that amount of water, 16.5 million acre feet of water? That's where we are right now. So in that sense, Colorado River shows you, the Colorado experience shows you what not to do. Volumetrically dividing river water is not a good practice. The UN actually says, seek adaptive measures, do not volumetrically divide the water, right? Because should demand rises, should waters go down, then we are in trouble. But also Colorado has a very good practice of evolving treaties in terms of minutes. So they did not just sign the agreement and just say, we're done. No, whenever something pops up, the agreement evolves through minutes. So they have, for example, the famous one is minute 319, where they catered for climate change, what to do in terms of drought times, how to transfer water between the countries. It's really nice. So we can take that experience from Mexico, from the US and Mexico. Evolving treaties, stay away from fixed volumetric allocations, but also address historical injustices. It was a huge step in terms of the US to try and address Mexico's grievances, right? From saying, we don't care about that, that's not our problem, to actually addressing historical injustices. That's a huge step. In South America, La Plata River Basin. It's shared by Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. Brazil and Argentina both, Brazil and Paraguay both wanted to develop hydropower around that area. These two countries were in conflict actually at the time of disagreements over borders. But instead of going to conflict, what did they do? They came together, they commissioned a study, and they built a co-owned infrastructure. What does that mean? They share the cost and they share the benefit. So the Itaipu Dam, it used to be the largest dam in the world before the dam in China was built. So they built the Itaipu Dam. It produces 14,000 megawatts of energy, clean energy, hydropower. And that energy is divided among Brazil and Paraguay, and they also share the cost. Now, I'm not saying this dam is like a perfect solution. It has a lot of environmental concerns, all of that, but it was a very safe way of moving about this conflict between the two countries. Moreover, because Paraguay is a much smaller country than Brazil, but it gets 50% of that massive energy production, what does it do? It sells the energy to Brazil, right? Regional integration, virtual water trade. That's a very, very productive way of going around conflict. So co-owned infrastructures. We have sort of the same experience in Africa, in the Senegal River Basin. They sort of adopted the same model. So they have the Diama dams, the Diama and Manantali dams between Senegal, Mali, and Guinea. And so these dams cater for the hydropower needs, the navigation needs, and irrigation needs of these three countries, right? Southern Africa, Lesotho Highland projects. So Lesotho, highland country, of water. South Africa, bigger population, needs water. So what did they do? They had a project where Lesotho would build dams in Lesotho, its own money, produce hydropower using the water and then sell water to South Africa. Win, right? Lesotho gets to produce hydropower. South Africa gets the most economically sourced water. Very, very economically friendly for South Africa. Jordan River Basin, not really known for positive. Yeah, I mean, it is a conflict area, but even within the conflict, there are lessons to learn. The Jordan River Basin is shared by Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, right? Hence countries, aside from water, they have their own issues. But in the 60s, there was an agreement brokered by the US, actually. It's called the Johnston Accord, which tried to allocate the waters within the countries. Did not work out. Egypt proposed an agreement, did not work out, and then Israel proposed its own agreement. It did not work out, but bringing these 10 countries together resulted in many, many, many bilateral and trilateral agreements, right? So even though the big agreement failed, the countries started talking among themselves. There were less smaller agreements that were signed between, for example, Jordan and Israel, right? So it opened the room for negotiations. It opened the room for collaborations, even though the bigger project did not work out. On top of that, this basin is known for the term it coined, rightful allocation. Now, that's not a term that used to be in the International Water Management Doctrine, but because Israel wanted to allocate the water and the other countries wanted their rights to the water guaranteed, what they came up with, okay, so you want allocation, you want your rights acknowledged, so let's coin a new term, rightful allocation, to pacify you and you as well, right? So the word might seem like pretty trite, but the effort of going through the process of appeasing each side, that's a big lesson to learn. That we can use that in the Nile Basin, for example. Ethiopia, upstream countries, they want the acknowledgement of their fair rights to develop. Sudan and Egypt downstream, they want assurance that their needs would also be met, right? So this approach could very, very wisely be used in that Nile Basin. Indus River Treaty, yes?
I'm sorry, just before we move on to this, my wife and I are from LA, so we're like proud, reluctant Los Angelinos. And part of the reluctance of like having any civic pride in LA is that it steals its water from everywhere because it's a desert town, you know. And so to sustain its population, a lot of that usage comes from the Colorado River, like you mentioned. And so I guess my question is, are you seeing also a similarity where a large desert population that is not totally sustainable downstream is contributing to economic downturn upstream? You know, Ethiopia, I'm sure from what I've seen, is a gorgeous country, but we also have heard in the news, you know, about economic struggles in East Africa and stuff like that. So I guess my question to you is, looking at that as a comparison, do you feel like, you know, the population is kind of curving that in a way so that countries upstream or states upstream, in the case of the Colorado River, are suffering at the expense of one population?
Make interesting points, but like the scales are not favorable for comparison.
Okay,
Does that
great.
make sense? Like, right, like
Sure.
between Egypt and Ethiopia, there's a lot of buffer countries, or between upstream countries. So you have a fair point in the sense that what happens downstream does affect the economics of the entire region. It might make water more expensive, less expensive. All that, it's hard to compare those two because of the scales.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
It's going to be a lot of questions, so if you can wrap up
Okay.
in the interest of time, yeah.
Point being, there are a lot of lessons to learn, right? And if you're interested, I can link this paper actually came out free open access, so you can read more about it. But these are just things that I thought would be beneficial for them now. There are many, many other lessons to learn from. So another thing that I tried to do is, one of the ways that we keep hearing about when we hear about transboundary water management is allocate the water, right? So during my master's studies, what I tried to do was, okay, what would it actually look like if we equitably allocated the water? For that, I went back and looked at international law. International law actually has factors to consider when designing equitable and reasonable use. So in my study, in my thesis, what I did was try to quantify the law, right? So I developed indicators for the factors that international law says and developed a framework that would divide the water among the countries. The one in red, that's my paper again. So that's the allocation that I came up with. I assure you the numbers are not important. The point being none, and I say none of the countries are going to be able to live off of their equitable shares, right? So just ensuring equity is also not going to ensure sustainability. Just ensuring sustainability is not going to pacify the question of equity. So those two things have to go together. Then, so to my mind at least, that leaves collaborative approaches on the table, right? So if there's no way that we're going to match our demands with our own supply, if water allocation, volumetrically dividing the water is not going to cut it, how do we move forward? Collaborative approaches, that's what experiences from the rest of the world actually show us. The common infrastructure route, virtual water trade, all that stuff. So in my thesis, to summarize, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to model the basin and project the future demand, the future available supply, and develop mechanisms to match the supply with the demand. But that doesn't happen in the vacuum. Again, these are all screenshots of cartoons that I took from newspapers, publications about the Nile. This actually is the situation on the Nile. Depending on who's reporting it, either Ethiopia is building a dam to starve Egypt in Sudan, or Egypt and Sudan are trying to prevent upstream countries from utilizing the water. There is a very deep lack of trust among the countries, historical baggage, because we went to war over this water. There's a level of mistrust that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily understand fully. There's the baggage of colonial era treaties, which when you say upstream countries don't have any share, it sounds bizarre. Like, how can you not have a share, right? But this is the stuff that Nile Basin has to deal with. When countries come to negotiate, this is the stuff that comes with them, right? So there's no way to consider collaborative approaches without also working on the trust issues, the historical baggage, right? The geopolitical influences of external countries, all of that. So diplomacy, particularly what we call type 3 diplomacy, people to people diplomacy. So when you normally hear the word diplomacy, you think heads of states talking to each other. That's called type 1 diplomacy. And then there's type 2 diplomacy, the stuff that we're doing, academics, like leaders talking to each other, right? And then there's type 3 diplomacy, people to people diplomacy, linking people through culture, music, folklore, because these essentially are people across the Nile Basin, they're brothers, they're sisters. They have mixed with each other through centuries of living together, right? So there's a lot of shared context, shared fabric, shared history that can link them together to at least open the room for negotiation, open the room for dialogue, develop empathy, right? So in addition to all the science that we do, in addition to all the negotiations that happens, there also needs to be work on healing that mistrust among the people. So this is my conceptualization of a comprehensive solution, which is what I'm trying to conceptualize in my thesis. Obviously, it has to be science data driven, but it also has to include geopolitical conditions, diplomacy, and then can't be just a sectoral. It has to be transdisciplinary, which makes the work all the more complicated and time taking. But it's based on that I developed my approach. So forecast, project the demand, project the supply. Now you know what to do, but also consider socioeconomic scenarios, political scenarios to try and see, okay, if we have XYZ conditions, what type of Nile Basin are we going to have? If there's collaboration in the basin, what kind of Nile Basin are we going to have? And plan for each one accordingly, right? So that's my methodology, and something like this is what I'm trying to develop for the Nile Basin. It's called an adaptive pathway. Think of a subway map if you've seen one before. It sort of gives you multiple routes, red line, green line, whatever, you can change here. So it gives you options of how to get from point A to point B, but depending on the amount of time you have, the amount of money you have, you get to choose the pathway, right? So that's called an adaptive pathway system, and I'm trying to develop something like that for the Nile Basin. This has been very useful in other contexts, for example, Southeast Asia and the aquaculture, and the Netherlands for flood management systems, and it allows you to manage for uncertainties, but also gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of which route to take. But yeah, that's my point. If you have any questions, comments, advice, I'm very open. I hope you enjoyed it. I did.
Thank you, Mekdelawait, for a very good presentation. I know you could.
I know we
do
can.
more of it. Let's give also the audience a chance to ask questions.
Yeah.
And also, for you guys here in attendance, I'll be putting a QR code on the screen so you guys could sign up.
I'm curious how technology innovation plays into this. Like I could see a transboundary condition where there's a wealthy country and a poor country. And the wealthy country can invest in, let's say, irrigation that they don't waste as much water, food production. So are people looking at technology to maybe provide more equity?
Not necessarily to provide more equity, but to just enhance efficiency because water is scarce. The basin is already water stressed. So, for example, Egypt has engaged in desalination to supplement their water because they already have a water deficit, even with the amount of water they use from the Nile. A country of 100 million people. So they have engaged in desalination, wastewater treatment to not large scale, but it is something. Can't say much about the other countries because one, there isn't massive use in the other countries as far as the Nile is concerned, but it's not looking forward, it definitely should have a bigger role because without enhancing efficiencies, like you said, like we said, there's no way of matching the demands with the supply. But as of now, a little bit of effort, particularly in Egypt, but not along the lines of ensuring equity, just enhancing.
And then who's at the table to ensure there's equitable water for the environment?
Good question. Right, as of now, not many.
No NGO at all?
Well, the Nile is very politicized. So when they come to negotiate, it's mostly heads of state. That room is not open for like civic organizations, NGOs yet. We don't know how it's going to be in the future, but I will say this, countries are aware of the environmental water need. So when they operate the dam, there's the minimum water requirement and they tend to be very generous to that.
My name is Inas. I am from the occupied territory in the West Bank, from Palestine. I took a class on boundary water in that region. I visited Jericho and the Jordan Valley, and I went with my husband to the baptism site, which was just very little bit of water that's very, very dirty. And it was just the exploitation of our natural resources. And I wanted to point out also to not only the equity, which we Palestinians don't have the right to access our own aquifers or the water, and the water is not going on a natural flow from the lake of the Galilee or the Tiberias Lake into the water in the Jordan River, then to feed the Dead Sea and then go down. It's just lots of sinkholes that was very unsafe to be around and it's impacting a lot of these tourism resorts. And so this the ecosystem is also we're not being fair for it. So it's not, the water is not distributed also with equity to the ecosystem. That's obviously showing problems like sinkholes. And because we're not system thinkers, we're not putting it all together, we're harming ourselves and the economy as well. So it's a threat to the tourism industry by the Dead Sea.
I couldn't have put it better. We're not system thinkers. That really is a very good statement. All of our solutions so far tend to be very narrow-minded, and systems thinking, that is exactly what we need. And the environment actually needs to be, and to his point as well, the environment actually needs to be a stakeholder, right? Like there are efforts across the world where they're trying to give personhood for rivers, the environment. That is one approach, but we can also just plan for it. But we have to already think about the environment as a stakeholder, right? So I appreciate your comment. Yeah.
We have a question from the online attendees. So you give them the chance, yeah.
Can I read it?
Hand raised. WB, you're on.
Oh, yeah, thank you for giving me the chance. So my question, first, thank you for sharing your thoughts and your presentation with all of us around the world. My question is, have you developed a criteria, like basic criteria for the sharing, like proposed criteria? And when you quantify the water, have you quantified all the whole hydrology, or is just the surface water getting to Aswan? Does it does have you included all the groundwater resources and also water availability out of the basin, which is like countrywide? Thank you so much.
Thank you, WB. Though all relevant, valid questions. And my research so far, I have distinguished between surface and groundwater because surface water groundwater interaction is a whole other beast on its own, which is definitely outside of my scope. But that is actually a thing to consider. If like one of the limitations of my study is that I actually divide the surface and groundwater. So I personally have not considered surface water groundwater interaction, but I do consider groundwater available in the basin as a source of alternate water used to satisfy the needs in the basin. For your first question, have I quantified indicators or factors to in water allocation? Not me, but thankfully the UN water law had criteria. So all I did was to assign numerical values to those factors that were already there. So yes, there are factors. And if you're interested, I also have a chapter published about my work on that, so I can send you the link to that. I think that's it. That's all the questions, right?
Yes, thank you. No, I was, one time I attempted this in terms of population or in terms of basin area or in terms of size, equitable is a subjective word and hard for a civil engineer to attach numbers to it. So that's why I asked you.
Exactly. No, exactly. And we can talk more about it if you want. What I developed is essentially a model which assigns weights to factors, but those weights are open to interpretation. For example, I had a mock play where I had stakeholders from countries assign their own weights, like so suppose representatives for different countries. So they would assign the weights to those factors. The factors are objective, the weights are subjective. And so that's how the equitable allocation would be designed per se. So you do raise an important issue. Equity is a subjective question, but there are objective mechanisms on the way to that subjective equity. So definitely we can talk more about it if you're interested. All the factors that you mentioned are included in my design of equitable water allocation. So I think my email was on the invite. So feel free to talk more about it.
Let me go.
You were mentioning like how equitable management is like subjective based on the country that's there. So like when, for example, Lake Nasser like came into fruition in like the early 70s or whatever it came, it didn't negate previous treaties that called for like equitable measures downstream and upstream as well. And how has like Lake Nasser like where it looks like it vividly takes a lot of like the Nile Basin out to their own lake and for their own people. How is that not being treated, on the reverse scale, like upstream?
You're asking the questions I asked too. So for context, what he's talking about is the High Aswan Dam. It's a massive dam just on the southern border of Egypt, which can carry 2.5 years worth of the Nile waters, right? So if the Nile stopped today, upstream countries would dry, but Egypt would have water for 2.5 years. That's the scale of the river. Your point, when that dam was being built, there was no prior notification to upper countries. There was no negotiation with upper countries. There was no discussion of how it's going to affect the basin, how it's going to establish existing uses downstream, which was going to essentially trap the ability of upstream countries to develop in the future, which is all those are questions that upstream countries raise now.
Even downstream, like people in the Mediterranean, the fishermen and all these things, because of like the sediments, they also said that they had like a very big impact in terms of their fishing qualities because of, and it's a different experience like swimming in like the Nile versus like, or being in the Nile versus just like looking at it from like an outside perspective. Because you see people, they're very like on board with it. They enjoy like how like they're able to go to the river, go back out,
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
go around. It's like you see something like civilizations being drowned, taken out because of like the flooding.
That's true. See, and this is the balance we have to strike when we're thinking of developing versus preserving nature, preserving civilizations, right? Like, you cannot say to people, don't have electricity, don't have food, don't have water, but also you do want to preserve the environment. You do want to not flood your ancient historic sites, because when dams were built, the UN had to, not Aswan High Dam, but when the Merowe Dam was built, the reservoir would have flooded the Abu Simbel historical sites in Sudan. So the UN had to mobilize and actually cut out those historical sites and move them elsewhere. So I hear you. I do hear you. Which is what makes the problem more complicated is, okay, how do we strike that balance between providing the basic necessities for people while also ensuring that the environment is not too damaged, or historical sites are not, it is a balance. And I empathize with you. I am an environmental scientist, but also I'm a trained engineer.
Is it too harsh to say?
Thank you. I think we have class, and I know this is interesting topic on, but thank you, Mekdelawait, for a nice presentation. We will share her email if anyone wants to follow up. But thank you, everyone.
Also, guys, we still have like refreshments to the front if you guys would like to. I'll bring it as well as some rose.
I'm gonna come. When I go into. Yeah.
The skin
Guys, you're